And now, deep thoughts.
Whoa, that's pretty deep.
Hey, this is the Deep Thoughts podcast, where every episode explores the Christian faith a little more deeply. I'm your host, Matt Shantz, and my guest in this episode is Andrew Wilson. Andrew is a prolific writer with a number of books, including 3 that we'll touch on in this episode. 3. He's a part of the Mere Fidelity podcast, co-hosts the Post-Christianity podcast with Glenn Scrivener. He is a pastor in London and regularly writes on the Think Theology website. We talk about loving and serving those with special needs and their families, about Eucharismatic worship. You got to keep listening to find out what that is, and why the year 1776 was such a big deal, and how the West is now post-Christian because of it. So now, here's my deep conversation with Andrew Wilson. So welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Thank you for having me, Matt. Great to be with you.
You just popped out for a little bit of milk. Now you're back home. Well done.
Oh, man, I did one interview about 3 months ago where my daughter, who has got quite serious special needs, came in, and she had clearly just, initially I thought she'd like eaten a person or something. She just had all the what looked like blood on her mouth, but it wasn't. She'd eaten a beetroot from the fridge, gone in there, taken it. Yeah. And I was on this podcast live, and then she smeared it on the wall. I was like, oh man, just terrible. Yeah. So yeah, going to buy milk is the least of my concerns.
Yeah, okay. Nice. Well, I just said this a second ago, but I'll say it again for the recording. Just appreciated you from afar for a long time. Your writing, your speaking ministry. But I did a little digging on you for this conversation. You went to Cambridge. I find you to be a brilliant mind. I'm slogging my way in the best. That's the best sort of slogging of Remaking the World. You're a prolific writer. Why are you a pastor? There's so many, and I think we need the pastor theologian, so I praise God for that. But what's the conviction that leads you to remain in the pastoral ministry?
Well, actually, initially, and I'm going to might alienate some of your listeners right off. I don't know. It's very much a charismatic background and backstory, and the church I pastor is like that. And I really had a very clear sense of, like, when people talk about the call of God, it's different for different people, but for me, it really was. I was in a sort of prophetic ministry time, and a young woman I don't even know now who she is or what, but brought this extraordinarily accurate, penetrating word. It just cut me to the heart. I thought, I had a choice at the time between pastoral ministry and a more academic, researchy kind of direct fork in the road, aged about 26, I guess. And I just knew God was speaking to me, and that was the confirmation I needed. And of course, once you get into it, you then realize this isn't just a job. This is well, as you know, it's a calling, a vocation, a sense of being set apart for pastoral ministry, eldership, we call it, that sort of thing. So a very clear sense of call up front. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. By virtue of being in a larger church like I am, I've been able to continue writing and doing lots of other stuff that serves wider, because I'm in for British terms anyway, quite a large church with quite a strong team, which means that some of the day-to-day things that many pastors are rightly doing, I don't have to do as much of, so I have got some time to write.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, I want to talk about 3 of your books briefly with our time, and I want to jump back to 2016. You and your wife, Rachel, wrote a book entitled The Life We Never Expected, Hopeful Reflections on the Challenges of Parenting Children with Special Needs. Brilliant book. I had Sam Albury on the podcast last year, and we talked about singleness, and it was the most popular episode of this podcast last year because it's often neglected in the church. Singles often feel, they hear all the talk of family, or like even at my church right now, we've got a marriage retreat coming up, and you just sort of sit there and it's like, everything has a little bit of pain or sharpness to it. And so talking about singleness, of course, it was really helpful to do. The same could be said about those with special needs in our congregations and their families. Would you mind just talking a little bit about your story and maybe what that might look like in the context of a local church?
Yeah, so we're around 2000. So my oldest two children now are 15 and 13. And my youngest is 7, and he doesn't have special needs, but the older two both do. And they've now, actually, since writing the book, gone in very different trajectories, really. So my older son, who they both have regressive autism, but my older son has developed really well and has progressed and been able to learn to do a lot of things we were never sure he would. He can read and write. He's very talkative. He has got a lot of understanding. He's very good at football, and in the British version with in fact, the version everyone plays outside of North America with the feet. But he's done so well. My daughter, Anna, is much more complex. She's 13, but she is developmentally now really at the stage of an 18-month-old in many ways, but is obviously physically like a normal 13-year-old. And that's really challenging. And she had epilepsy as well. And her official diagnosis is something called childhood disintegrative disorder, which is just horrible. It's as horrible as it sounds. Basically means you learn skills and then at about 2.5, you lose them and go backwards. And so she's still less able now, a lot less able now than she was when she was 2. And that is obviously, that's been really hard. It's been very short. You get used to it in the end. You work it through. I think we wanted to write the book young and early because I hope this wasn't arrogance. I hope it was a genuine sort of conviction. I think it was that if we didn't write it while we were still in it, and still it was very real, and we still weren't sleeping, and we were very hounded on all sides by the reality, and we didn't know we were going to have a third child at the time, of course. I think we would have lost some of its rawness, and its edge would have gone. Yeah. And actually, I think that's true. I sometimes reread, my wife particularly tells me things that we lived through, which I've just completely blanked. I'm like, I don't remember that at all. And she would tell me a story about an appointment she went to or an awkward moment, and I just realized that I don't remember this even happened. My brain has screened out because that's what we do. We heal. Yeah. But as a result, we wrote it when the kids were still very young and we were still very much in the thick of it. But God has used it to touch people, often not special needs people, actually. It's been people sometimes single people, actually, or people who have experienced something that they didn't expect in life, that meant that life gave them something they didn't want, and then they had to work out how to re-find faith and joy and hope in the midst of it. And I think that's probably what that book has become, even though that's not quite what we intended.
Oh, thank you for sharing that and for writing that. I don't know how, if you weren't sleeping and it was raw, you were writing a book as a couple, but good on you guys.
I'm not. I was dating that, but it was really good because I think we probably some of the work. I think we must have done most of the work for it once my daughter had finally got into school. I think for us, the preschool years, I think many parents would say this, of course, but the preschool years were just so intense and so hard. Right. And probably what happened was, having adjusted to paired right back and then got the children to school, Rachel in particular, I still had a job, of course, so I had to go to work and stuff, but Rachel had the capacity to give the time to write. And to be honest, most people would say that she's completely carried the book, like as in I'm very much the passenger, and she's because particularly women who obviously have read the book a lot have come out and said, oh man, it's just what she said in particular, I think really spoke to what it was like to be them. Wow. And most pastors, of course, don't write for that kind out of that kind of experience, but it has been our story, and actually the story of a lot more people in ministry than I'd realized when we started working on it. But it seems to have been timely.
Would you apply it for us a little bit to the local church, like the people of God, and these are individuals that God cares about deeply, and what does that look like for a congregation, for God's people to embrace and love and create the kind of space for it to be just the wonderful family of God for special needs folks and their families? What would be a word of help?
Well, it obviously it's a useless answer in a way, but it just depends so much on both sides, really. It depends. I think smaller churches have very different responses to larger churches. I think a larger church might be able to run a ministry which serves a whole number of people, connects them with one another, provides mutual support, provides childcare context for certain things is able to. I mean, a friend of mine who leads a church near us, we were on the phone the other day. They're just fitting a sensory room. Like they can actually make really big, and some big churches, no doubt, in North America do the same. You can take quite big, bold, expensive steps because you've got a large enough base of probably volunteers in the church and perhaps even money to be able to provide a proper ministry. At the other end of the spectrum, a church that's, the size of an extended family, 40 or 50, is obviously got a very different approach. That it's much more out of the sort of love and nurture and support of the family in particular. And everyone will know that the children with special needs by name and will be able to roll with the way that they are. I think sometimes what happens is it's actually the churches in the middle that can get stuck, where you have a church where, like a lot of churches in your nation and mine, which is somewhere between 120 and 200, which is large enough that not everyone knows what's going on and not everyone knows what that child's condition is, and if they're expressing themselves in a way that makes people feel uncomfortable, how to respond. But then the church isn't large enough to be able to run something that actually supports and sustains the family through it. And that can be much more difficult. And I think that probably takes leading into, at a pastoral level, that the pastors have to step towards that family and say, how can we support you? But acknowledging that there have to be limitations on what that is. And I think most of us who have kids with special needs will know there's just a limited amount. At some seasons of life, there's a limited amount the church can reasonably do. Even special needs schools, like the ones my kids go to, are limited in how much they can deliver. And the state invests a lot in kids like mine, but it still doesn't solve all of our problems. So I don't think most of us as parents are hoping the church will just completely reorient itself around our children. But I do think there can be a particular challenge in the sort of medium-sized church, which probably takes a bit more pastoral engagement and a tailoring, in a sense, of what is deliverable for the church and the family.
Yeah. Well, that's helpful. Yeah. Is there something specific that really blessed you and Rachel, or just the way people came around you two, or the way they treated or engaged your children? Is it, or maybe because of writing this book, other families where you've heard what's really blessed them? Are there certain things that typically do, whether it's particular things you say or actions or supports? What does it look like that's been a blessing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously when you first find out something is wrong, I know lots of people with special needs wouldn't express it that way, and neither would their parents. So I don't want to generalize for everyone. This is just our experience, and those are probably many we know. But I think when you first find out something is wrong, people, a little bit like you would teach people to engage with anything that was sad, with grief, bereavement, or divorce. What people initially need is a sense of, sympathy and connection. And is there anything, I'm so sorry. How can I help? Is there anything I can do? We love you. We're praying for you. All those sorts of, they sound platitudes, but they are actually what you need in most situations, in my experience, of significant sort of grief, which is what we went through, and many do. But I think what a lot of parents will hope could happen, and it isn't always possible for good reasons, is often what you need, particularly with a more complex situation or medical condition or development delay, is actually a one-to-one. Is like often that is the golden ticket, is that there is someone in the church who says, we've had a number of people who've done that for our kids, but one woman in particular in our church, Jenny, who basically every week for the last 10, 12 years has sat near our family, danced with Anna during worship, tickled her, played with her, taken her out the room, taken her upstairs. For many years, we had 2 services, and she would go to one for herself and go to the other one to help with Anna. Now she's a single woman, she's about our age. You cannot create that person. Like if that person isn't in the church, no one should feel the obligation to become her. But my experience is the very best thing that a lot of kids, particularly with more complex needs, is someone who can engage with the child over a long haul. And now that's impossible. You just can't conjure that up. God has to do a work in that person's heart, and that's by His grace what He did with us. But so that's probably the best. If a church were going, if I could wave a wand and create a thing, what would it be? It might often be something even as simple as that. But it's just such a long haul way of serving.
Praise God for the Jennies among us, eh? Wow.
Yeah.
That's so good. I appreciate that. Well, Spirit and Sacrament is, I love this book. Like I cannot overstate it. I love this book. This was timely for me a couple of years ago. I would say our church is in some ways in the process of walking through some of the goals of this book, and really appreciative of it. I also respect a good making up of a word, which you did. I got a lot of time for that. Eucharismatic, I think, right? Is that?
Yeah.
Eucharismatic. So you're taking like the Eucharistic and charismatic and blending those two. Charis, the grace, the common thread there. But such a great book. It's interesting because so often churches that we're familiar with are either sort of highly liturgical or Eucharistic, and sometimes or regularly it seems that they're often somber or serious or very put together. And then you've got these charismatic churches that are, whatever, the opposite, like very free, sometimes wild. And what you're advocating for in the book is why one without the other? Why not the best of both? Why do you think churches tend towards a sort of the one or the other, and why are both important?
So I think the reason there are many reasons why we do tend towards one or the other, but I think what some of the factors that seem most prominent to me is a combination of personal preference and personality and historical trajectory. So which I think then interact with each other in quite interesting ways. So don't think it's fundamentally a theological issue. That's where I think convincing people you can do both needs to be done theologically.
Yes.
And many people will defend things theologically. But I think in the end, there are people for whom exuberance and noise and unpredictability and spontaneity and froth and bubbles and emotion and people waving their hands and shouting is actually a really appealing, expressive. People would value, as I do, right? People would value those things. They would say that shows that people mean it. There is a lot of cultures are like that, right? So a lot of parts of the world, you think that is just simply how people interact, not only in church, but that's how they would celebrate their ancient traditions as a community. That might be how they would celebrate. That's how the weddings are. Right. And in many, many examples, and there'd be lots of places, globally where that would be true. And some of that's sort of this personality. And then at the other end, you have people again for whom sort of clarity of thought and rigor and depth, seriousness, intelligence, lucidity, aesthetics, where those things are very important values. Excellence of sort of musical intricacy, those sorts of things, history and rootedness to the past, where those things would all be values. And they would all be really, really important to people. And people say, this is actually a preference. This is something that I really enjoy. And it's, and so I remember we had Carl Trueman on our podcast. That name. And he was just saying I could talk about the mega church thing, but at the other end of the spectrum, hey, being traditional is an aesthetic too. I like the old hymns. And I think it's quite wise to know, even just at a personal level, we have those preferences. So that's going on. Similar, and they're often not many people would by preference say, I really love both. Most people know which way they want. I'm very extroverted, loud, boisterous sort of person. And I've had, I'm learning, I'm growing into the other side, but I know that my personality leads that way. So that's one dynamic. The other is that, of course, in the history of the church, one of the things that has happened is one of the cases I make in the book is for the first 300 or 400 years, this divide was nowhere near as acute. But in the last 500, and particularly in Protestantism, the very experiential God could break in at any time now. He can say something new. He can challenge you, break something open in your life. Pray, God might interrupt, bang, and here it is, and now someone's got healed. That sort of wing of the church was pretty wacky, had pretty but not great eschatology, theologically quite unstable, and a number of practices that quickly meant that within the first 20 or 30 years of the Reformation, in fact, within the first 5 years of the Reformation, Luther was having to come back and go, hang on a second, no, we're not doing that. We're not. Yep. And so I think what that happened is rolled forward over the next 5 to 10 decades, that sort of by the early 17th century, you just have two quite different expressions of Protestant Christianity, in some ways in reaction to what medieval Catholicism viewed, or the way they thought about prophetic ministry or apostolic authority or miracles or relics and shrines and all of that jazz, much of which I wouldn't subscribe to at all as a Protestant. But then what happens is, of course, the church develops two quite different threads and trajectories, and Pentecostalism in the last 100 years has been a sort of significant disruptor in its own strand, but really it's drawing from a more pietist, experiential, and in some ways in tone Anabaptist-y flavor, even though a lot of Pentecostals are Anglicans or whatever. And meanwhile, the Reformed have obviously they are more rightly hesitant about a lot of those practices and have become much more rigorous and rich and theological. So I think it's a mixture of those two factors working in concert. Personality preferences and historical trajectories that were really sort of accidents in a way. I think we might have saved ourselves a lot of problems if the Vicar prophets or the early Anabaptists hadn't done what they did. But I think those things set in motion are twin tracks. And what I'm, of course, the largest part of what I'm trying to do in the book and in my life and ministry is to try and restore those two brothers to one another, really, and say, look, really, there is a huge amount of benefit to doing both of these things and experiencing the best of both of them together. Yeah,
absolutely. Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, because we're not supposed to despise prophecies, right? And so sometimes in certain the Eucharistic or some of the Reform circles, whatever you might call it, we're about the Bible. We're about God's word. Well, God's word says don't despise prophecies, and you're despising of the word that might be given here. Or seek the higher gifts and really utilizing spiritual gifts that really bless the body. And we're not truly being all that faithful if we're not really tapping into the fullness of really what the church is meant to look like. What's sort of your theological, maybe even pragmatic case as a pastor for both?
Well, that's a huge question. And obviously the book is an attempt really to answer that. I think when I'm in Britain, I'm mainly talking to charismatics about why they could become more liturgical. When I'm in North America, I'm talking to more people from a more Bible churchy background or bit of liturgy about why you might be able to have a bit more liturgy, but certainly be more charismatic. And I don't know how representative that is in Canada, but certainly in the US, that's the dynamic normally. And my case there is, to be honest, you gave a very good summary of it just now with the sort of the exhortations to spiritual giftedness in the church in Paul. And I find 1 Corinthians, maybe I did my PhD study there, that's probably part of it, but that's where I've gone because I think in chapters 11 to 14 of 1 Corinthians, Paul gives he responds to a lot of problems in the church, but as a result gives us some really rich material on the corporate worship life of a church. And he does a deep dive on the Lord's Supper. In fact, in chapter 10, he does 2 deep dives on the Lord's Supper. And in chapters 10 and 11, and he keeps saying this phrase, when you come together, and then addressing a problem. When you come together, do it like this. When you come together. But interestingly, of those, he uses that phrase 7 times, and some of them are about the Lord's Supper, as if this is obviously what you're going to do when you come together. And some of them are about using spiritual gifts like prophecy and languages and interpretation and healing. And he says, when you come together, and his assumption, and not just his assumption actually, as you rightly pointed out in chapter 14 and verse 1, his instruction eagerly desire spiritual gifts. He is working on the basis that the church is going to be a charismatic community and a liturgical community. And that's why I use the word eucharismatic in that way, to try and bring them together. And I think there have been some ingenious attempts to sort of keep that to the first century or even the AD 50s and 60s until Paul's death. But I'm trying to make an extended case in the book that I think that's just thoroughly unhelpful. I don't think the argument works at all. I think Paul sees the expiration of spiritual gifts in the future. He does. He knows the gifts are going to expire, and he says when the perfect comes, when we see face to face. I think for Paul, the idea that the gifts are going to sustain us throughout this life and until we see Jesus face to face, to me seems very clear. And I think the bar is very high, if I'm honest, to say Paul says eagerly desire spiritual gifts, especially prophecy, and you say, we don't have to do that one. I think you have to clear a very high exegetical bar to make that case. And I respect scholars who've disagreed, and Tom Schreiner and I have had some, for instance, have had some really, really good conversations and debates about this. But I think in the end, the burden of proof is on the person who says there are a whole bunch of New Testament instructions about church worship that we don't have to observe today. And I just don't think you can make that case. And there's a historical argument for it too, but we won't go into that now. Very well said. I appreciate that. This is a caricature, of course, but essentially it's compelling to say to the charismatic folks, let there be great depth. Let there be depth here. Let there be
truth and some structures here. And to the folks who have the structures, that love the truth, it's saying, you can be alive, you know. You can you can have some joy in the Lord. It's okay. And what you advocate for, I think, is very biblical and beautiful. I think our churches need that. I think the future is bright for the church if we would be both liturgical about the Eucharist, about the Lord's Supper, about those structures, liturgy, and alive, and the Spirit of God working and moving, and the gifts that he wants to give the congregation through that. Yeah. So thank you so much for that book. We're going to do an unfair breeze of this one, but I'm working through this right now, Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West. You say 1776, more than any other year in the last millennium, is the year that made us who we are. This is a book about 1776, but also about why things are the way they are today. And you use the acronym WEIRDER to describe everything that took place in 1776. Can you just unpack WEIRDER?
Yeah, so WEIRDER is kind of adapted from a psychologist called Joseph Henrich, who came up with the acronym WEIRD 10 or 15 years ago to describe Western people. And it stands for, in my slightly extended WEIRDER, it stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, ex-Christian, and romantic. And it is an acronym to try and summarize what makes people distinctive if they live in the modern West, and actually increasingly, of course, through globalization, lots of other parts of the world as well, where particularly in urban areas, things are increasingly weirder, even if they're not sort of fully sort of Western in the traditional sense. But Western is kind of obvious in a sense. Educated, we value education very highly, but also we pay for it. We put a very high esteem on it, and we are the creatures of the Enlightenment, is what that chapter is about. Industrialized, machines, rich, we are, the great enrichment means that we are dramatically better off than we were in the 1760s, for instance. Democratic, obviously through the American Revolution, I tell that story in the book. In 1776, we are ex-Christian in the sense that the values that have shaped us are Christian ones, but we're now trying to leave them behind, but we haven't really. And we are romantic in the sense that the Romantic Revolution in arts, music, letters has completely changed the way we think about duties and obligations, the self, authenticity, following your heart, all those sorts of themes present in every good Disney movie. And what I do is in the book is I say, this is who you are. This is what the world is like now, and you probably recognize it. And then I say those 7 things are all true because of, and in very close connection to, major world events that took place in 1776. Yeah. Captain Cook's voyages, the American Revolution, the invention of the steam engine, the publication of The Wealth of Nations and the way people understood economic growth at the time, the abandonment of Christianity in the High Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment views on all sorts of things, science, women, history, Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, or all these sorts of things, which are all happening ones, and the Romantic movement as well. All of which I try and use a small thing to explain a very big thing. And so 1776 is that small thing. It's the year through which you can tell that story. And so it's kind of fun, I hope. Oh, yeah. It's a sort of historical journey, unusual kind of book for me, but it's been really fun as a story. I think it's a great story. I don't mean I've written one, but I think the story itself is brilliant. And I think seeing how these different movements connect to today has initially, at least, it seems to have proved quite fascinating for people who've not really thought about it, particularly in America, where they go, well, we only know about one thing in this year, and that's our story. But it's like, no, it's much bigger than you think, and there's loads of other stuff going on. It is fascinating. Like, it's just a fascinating book. There's just nothing quite like it. Yeah, and enlightening, right? I didn't know all this stuff. I didn't know all of this stuff. 1776. Oh, like you think American Revolution and maybe not much further, or if you're a different part of the world, you might think something else. But fascinating. So people need to read it to hear you unpack and make all these connections. It's so great. But towards the end of the book, you write that the church is often directly threatened by the changes taking place in the West. I think every Christian listening to this will feel that to some degree. You also say, but also indirectly, Christianity is responsible for bringing many of them about. These very things that we're feeling threatened about right now. How so? So I think people sometimes comment Christianity's been its own gravedigger, or I use the phrase, we've been hoisted by our own petard. Much of the book tries to tell the story of those changes. I don't try to have to shoehorn it in. It's just simply historically the case that the way the Enlightenment happened and the way even industrialization happened, and certainly the way democratic norms came to be accepted, are very connected to the Christian roots of the Western societies in which those things took place. So Christianity in that sense has given birth to a whole load of children, you might say, who then in a slightly Oedipal way turn around and try to kill their parents. And that's the dynamic of much of what's taking place, even in, I mean, it's less, I think, I imagine maybe less true in your country, and in mine, but the culture war dynamic, which I'm sure still exists in some form in Canada and Europe, but certainly in America, is Tom Holland calls it's like a civil war within Christianity, but only one half of that, only one side realizes it's still Christian. So there's the sort of the Christian conservative side and the progressive anti-Christian side that doesn't realize it's actually in some way the hyper-Christianity rather than a sub-Christianity. It's almost certain Christian beliefs getting detached from a certain other Christian beliefs. And well, Chesterton says this, the modern world is full of the ancient Christian virtues gone mad. And that's basically what happens in the culture wars. You end up with some Christian virtues on each side being detached from others. But the odd thing is, of course, they are engendered by Christian belief, the impact of, I can't remember which writer first used the idea of we are all living in the crater created by the Jesus asteroid. Christ comes to earth, bang, and everyone's now left in this crater going, wow, what do we do with this? And we are living in it. And they're oddly, though, creating problems for the church in living out those sort of post-Christian values. And it's a fascinating dynamic, which I think those of us who pastor at least, and all of us who want to think intelligently about it, have to understand.
So simultaneously with all the weirder world that was taking shape from 1776 on, simultaneously Great Awakenings, evangelical revivals, the Moravian and Methodist movements also took place in the 18th century. So my last question is really, how did Christianity flourish in the midst of the remaking of the world? What can we learn from them? Or said another way, how can Christians thrive in the weirder world of the 21st century?
Yeah, I mean, and that is, of course, that's what you that's where the pastor in me comes out, in that's what I try and land the book with, 2 chapters on that. Yeah. The way I do it, it's not the only one of doing it. And Glenn Scriven and I did an 8-part podcast series because he's done a lot of work on this too, where we talked, called Post-Christianity, where we talked about that issue in a lot more detail. But the 3 that I pick out in the book are grace, freedom, and truth. Effectively, what happens is that in the late 18th century, right the way through, really, but peaking in the late 18th century, the sort of personal experience of transformative grace becomes a much bigger part of the evangelical narrative, as it still is in all of the songs, I expect, somewhere that you sing at your church and mine. There is the freedom thrust of both abolitionism, particularly in Britain, and religious freedom in North America. And then there is the sort of a character who most people won't know called Johann Georg Hamann, who is a German philosopher, Christian philosopher, who's just a genius and basically outflanks gives a meta-critique of the Enlightenment with respect to our understanding of truth. And he provides this extraordinarily complex and clever response to Kant, and particularly Kant and many others at the time. And so I try and introduce these 3 developments in the late 18th century and then say, actually, those 3 things are enormously important and valuable for those of us ministering in the post-Christian West, whether we are doing it in formal ministry like I am and you are, or whether we're just living in it and trying to understand how people think and feel and how we help them. Because actually grace, and sense of the Christian doctrine of grace, for very good cultural reasons, is, if anything, more appealing now than it would have been in many kind of cultures. That sense of the relief that you are not made, your identity, your status, they're not conferred by your works. They're given to you. And a rounded vision of freedom, in which freedom is both freedom from things without and freedom from things within, your desires, is really important in helping people who've got a very lopsided vision of freedom. And then our understanding of truth as well, in the sense of, in a post-truth world, being able to say, no, there is cognitive dissonance at the heart of the West. We have evolved from apes, and therefore we should love one another. That's how the Russian philosopher Vladimir Solovyov puts it. And whatever you think about evolution and love, you say those beliefs do not follow from each other. No. It's actually Christianity that's the foundation you need to sustain that belief.
Yeah.
And effectively what I then do in that sense is to try and appeal to people that you believe these things, but this is why you're right, rather than you believe these things and this is why you're wrong, which is often what apologetics can do, and sometimes has to, but that's what I'm trying to do in that section. So yeah, this is a really important, this is what comes out, I hope, whenever I'm preaching it. It's an attempt to try and join the dots between the things people believe and the Christian reasons why they should believe them.
So great. Well, this was a whirlwind trip through 3 of your books. And
Sorry about that.
I'm so thankful for you, Andrew. I love your ministry. Thank you and thank your church for giving you time to write such great things that help so many of us. I will write the King. Let him know you've fulfilled your Commonwealth duty of talking to a Canadian pastor. Grateful for that. Grateful for you. Appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you so much, Matt. Lovely to see you.
Well, that was a fascinating conversation. I commend Andrew Wilson and his work to you. We just scratched the surface on those books. He's got others. I'm including links in the show notes to podcasts and books and his ministry, and just encourage you to follow up wherever you would like. Hey, thanks for listening to Deep Thoughts. I hope it helps you in fostering deep faith.